Okay, hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this session of the 2025-2026 Contemporary Spiritual Practices online lecture, which is organized as part of the Contemporary Spiritual Practices, or CSP, network, which is a subgroup of the European Association of Social Anthropologists, EASA. My name is Margaret Brady, and I am truly honored and happy to be chairing what is sure to be a very interesting session today that I'm looking forward to. The CSP network is a relatively new but increasingly important space for scholars working on spirituality, embodiment, and healing in contemporary anthropology. Tonight, or today, whatever time it is you're tuning in from, marks the third event in our annual lecture cycle. Before we begin, we would like to take a moment to sincerely thank our colleagues Emily Pierney and Yael Densak, who curated last year's series with great commitment and vision. Their excellent work laid the foundation for what we're continuing this year, and we are truly grateful for their contribution. We would also like to thank Denise Lombardi and Manéli Farahmand because not only are they presenting their work today, they are also heading up the organization of the 2025-2026 lecture series. So thank you for continuing the important work of Emily and Yael that they laid the foundation for. For this 2025-2026 lecture series, we have prepared a rich and diverse program consisting of 6 events, which will run to the end of 2026. The lineup includes 2 book presentations, that of Manéli and Denise today, which is the second one, with the first being Leo Bernard in November of 2025 that kicked off the lecture series. It also includes 2 keynote lectures. We had the pleasure of hearing from Sarah Pike in January, and the second will be in October with David Napier and 2 workshops. The first will be in May with Yael Dunsek and Emily Pierney, which I will discuss more at the end of today's session, and Giovanna Paragiani in December. The series aims to explore emerging perspectives in anthropology, perspective, and healing practices, and we hope these sessions will foster productive dialogue and intellectual exchange among all of us. We warmly invite you not only to participate in the events, but also to help us spread the word. Please feel free to share our announcements with your networks, with colleagues, students, and anyone who might be interested. Registration is easy. Just send us an email to csp.easa@gmail.com. I'll put the email in the chat, and we'll make sure you receive all the necessary information. Thank you for joining us again this evening or whatever time it is for you, and we're looking forward to a stimulating and thought-provoking year together. And now, with no further ado, I would like to introduce Manéli and Denise. Manéli Farahmand is a doctor in social sciences of religions. She currently heads the Intercantonal Information Center on Beliefs, the CIC, an applied research center in Geneva. In parallel, she did her postdoctoral research at the University of Fribourg in the Department of Social Sciences as part of the SNSF project, The Dynamics of Ritual and Embodiment in Contemporary Religion and Spirituality, for which she worked on ecstatic dance in Switzerland. She is currently applying for her habilitation at the University of Fribourg. Her research is at the intersection of gender issues, contemporary spiritualities, and ethnic cosmologies, with expertise in Central America and contemporary spirituality in Switzerland. Her book, which she is talking to us about today, is based on her PhD thesis titled Maya Neo-Shamanism revisited past female power and spiritual conquest, which was published in 2022 by Antipodes Editions. Denise Lombardi is an Italian anthropologist of religion who specializes in contemporary spiritualities in Western societies. She is a lecturer at the École pratique des hautes études in Paris and an adjunct professor at the Institut Catholique de Paris and an associate researcher at the Groupe Sociétés, Religion et Laïcités Laboratoire, the GSRL, and her work focuses on contemporary spirituality, neo-shamanism, therapeutic pluralism in Western societies, and CAM, complementary and alternative medicine in the oncological field. She has conducted fieldwork in France, Italy, Mexico, and Switzerland. And Denise is the author of numerous scholarly articles and is part of several international networks on contemporary spirituality and health. And with no further ado, I would like to invite our presenters to begin their presentation with us today.
Okay, so to understand shamanism, it is useful to begin with the Roberta Maillon, the EPHE scholar who devoted her life to the study of Siberian shamanism. Her work helps us avoid seeing shamanism as a fixed or timeless tradition. For Maillon, shamanism is an ancient phenomenon, but one that constantly reappears, adapts, and changes under new influences. It should not be understood as the pure survival of a distant past, because so-called traditional societies were never outside history. In the hunting societies she studied, animals were believed to depend on invisible spiritual powers. The shaman was the master of the animals. In this context, the shaman acted as a mediator with the invisible world, helping to restore balance and ensure the return of game. It is also important to remember that the word shaman comes from Tungusic languages and entered with written history in the 17th century, before becoming a scholarly category in the West. Shamanism is therefore not a fixed reality, but also a concept shaped by anthropology. A second key, the man that we can see in the picture, is Michael Harner, the anthropologist who developed what he called core shamanism through the Foundation for Shamanic Studies, a universalized and highly structured form of shamanic practice that became very influential in the modern West. His approach aimed to extract common elements from different non-Western traditions and turn them into accessible technique, especially the use of the drum to enter altered states of consciousness without psychotropic substances. This development was shaped by three major influences: Harner's own fieldwork with Jivaros and the utilization of ayahuasca, the countercultural impact of Carlos Castaneda's writings, and the wide circulation of Mircea Eliade's book Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. Eliade was crucial in defining shamanism as a spiritual technique centered on ecstasy and access to the invisible, although his approach has been criticized for detaching shamanism from its historical and social contexts. Neo-shamanism is a term used by scholars that I find very useful, and it refers to a group of spiritual practices with therapeutic aims, often open to other healing systems and shaped by an idealized image of the indigenous figure. In my research, I have analyzed neo-shamanic seminars held in Western contexts where participants learn a set of therapeutically oriented practices that draw on references to indigenous cosmologies. These seminars do not involve psychotropic substances. Instead, through the sound of the drum, participants are guided on a journey to discover their totem animal. What I find especially interesting is that these seminars are presented not only as spaces of healing, but also spaces of learning. People attend them not only to feel better, to work through difficulties, or to make sense of suffering, but also to learn techniques, gestures, and way of acting, and sometimes even to learn how to heal others in turn. In this sense, participants occupy an ambivalent position. They come both to be healed and to learn how to heal. The boundary between receiving and transmitting care, therefore, becomes increasingly blurred. This is linked to the reproducible dimension of these practices. The shamanic journey, for example, is no longer reserved for a single ritual expert. It becomes an experience that participants learn to reactivate on their own, even outside the seminar. The ritual is thus designed not as one-time exceptional moment, but as something that can be repeated and extended into everyday life. Participants also learn to sacralize ordinary space by recreating sacred environments at home through objects, gestures, atmospheres, and sometimes altars. Finally, these seminars create a suspended time apart from ordinary life, in which totemic animals and spirit guides mediate access to other cosmologies and other ways of relating to the living and the invisible. This perhaps is where their therapeutic force lies. In a world often experienced as desacralized, they restore a place for the sacred and reinscribe suffering within a shared framework of meaning. When I speak here of neo-shamanism, I'm referring above all to a therapeutic form of shamanism. I think it can also be understood as a contemporary ecology of care. By this, I mean that these practices do not necessarily replace medicine or psychotherapy. Rather, they are added to them and become intertwined with them. People often move from one register to another. They might consult a doctor, undergo therapy, and at the same time take part in a neo-shamanic seminar. So what we see is less an opposition between medicine and spirituality than a circulation between different ways of taking care of oneself. To understand what is happening in these seminars, we need to see them as a genuine ritual dispositives of care. They are not simply moments in which healing is discussed. They are structured settings that produce an experience of transformation. First, participants enter a space set apart. The place is prepared, symbolically marked off, separated from everyday life. In a sense, they step outside ordinary time. Habitual routine are suspended, and this already makes it possible to become differently available to one's feeling, to one's body, to one's emotions, and to one's suffering. Then there's the sensory and collective dimension, the drum, the practitioner's voice, the breath, the ritual objects, and the presence of the group all work together. The ritual does not merely represent something, it acts upon the way people feel, live, and interpret what is happening to them. Finally, there's a process of self-reformulation through figures such as the totem animal, the spirit guide, or the inner child. Participants are able to reread their experience, give meaning back to suffering, and sometimes recover a sense of coherence. So when I speak of contemporary ecology of care, I mean that these seminars are places where different therapeutic logics meet, the medical, the psychological, and the spiritual. And for many participants, it is precisely in this articulation that their effectiveness is produced. Manéli.
Thank you. Thanks, Denise. Thank you also, Margaret, for the introduction. For my part, for my research, in terms of what type of neo-shamanism, in a sense, it was quite different from the type of neo-shamanism that Denise observed in her fieldwork. My research focused on what we could say contemporary spiritual milieu in Central America and Western Europe that claim some pre-colonial shamanic heritages that are in the discourses associated with Maya cultures. And it is not really possible to speak of one single form of neo-shamanism. It was a comparative and multi-sited ethnography that has shown precisely how actually diverse is this field. In Guatemala, I was doing fieldwork in the department of Quetzaltenango, and there I mainly observed a rather politically active form of indigenous shamanic revival. These movements sometimes also mobilize New Age language in a millennial perspective, among other around this idea of a shift of paradigm associated with the Maya calendars. And they also use the notion of spirituality, but in an anti-colonial sense, to reaffirm a Maya cosmovision wanting to emancipate them from Christian influences. And in Guatemala, so I was doing fieldwork in a small community that is called Checam, where I observed Quiche Maya rituals, and that they were officiated by Achkijap. They are said to be spiritual guides or the keepers of time, the keepers of the ritual calendar. They do not necessarily define themselves as shaman. The notion was not actually used. And their practices are frequently marginalized in this community, often banned or demonized by evangelicals. In recent years, around 30 evangelical churches, mostly Pentecostal, have established themselves in this community and competing with one single Catholic church known for its progressive liberation theology stance since the 1980s. So there is a religious landscape here that is kind of marked by conflict and the stigmatization around Maya spirituality that has recently led to some episodes of violence. And the practices of the Achkijap I have met include some community or family rituals based on offerings and reciprocity, dedicated to ancestors, and also offering rituals aimed at restoring balance in case of illness. These rituals also involved local plants, such as copal, for example, that is a pine resin burnt like incense to communicate with the ancestors. Or they also used the ruda. It's a plant that is also used to cleanse people by passing a bundle of plants over the body. And those Achkijap in Guatemala they were often speaking about the spirituality as a science, about Maya science, to describe kind of complex, structured cosmovision and knowledges, and particularly around the ritual calendar. And so after Guatemala, I did some ethnographic fieldwork in the southeast of Mexico, in the Yucatan area and in Chiapas. And in Yucatan, I have met spiritual movement that was rereading pre-colonial Maya traditions through New Age and esoteric language, including some belief in ascended masters or in the age of the Aquarius, or some theories around frequencies or changes of frequencies on Earth. And they were composed mainly of mestizo Mexicans, but more broadly people from across Latin America and people from Western Europe. And one specific aspect here was that ethnicity was a kind of inner or spiritual experience. The people I've met used to describe themselves as Maya at heart, or as reincarnations of cosmic Mayas. So in Mexico, it was not a kind of a pick and choose shamanism, or neither a neo-shamanism in line with Michael Harner that Denise explained before, or nor a kind of activist indigenous movement, but rather some neo-ethnic recomposition in which identity was not actually related to language, to territory, to politically aspect, but it was more affective and ritually performed. And in these neo-shamanic rituals in Mexico, there were also a lot of references to local Maya cosmovision, and that provided a kind of local grounding, giving a certain cultural shaping. But they were often reread within the frame of contemporary spiritualities. And there was also this therapeutic dimension, but all these cultural references were really putting these practices in relation with the collective identity narrative. Try to change my... And finally, I also did field work in Switzerland and Germany. For example, I observed a sweat lodge ritual, which is called Temazcal in Nahuatl, that is a house of steam. It was in Germany near Stuttgart, and it was led by a Maya spiritual guide that was invited from Mexico. He was invited to a German neo-shamanic center, and there also some adaptations were made to fit to the local context between pan-Indian reinterpretation and some psychological aspects. So about this issue, there is this very interesting article, I think the reference is on the slide, from René de la Torre and Cristina Gutierrez, and they show how actually the traditional sweat lodge is not really an individual practice. It is more a family, a communal, a local indigenous practice for purification, hygienist, or therapeutic purpose. It is embedded in Mesoamerican popular medicine. It is used to heal pain, illness, or for postpartum care, and to maintain the collective balance. And today, the sweat lodge has been widely appropriated in neo-shamanic context. The sessions often include meditations, singings, prayers, and visualization of power animals. And so that's a little bit that kind of neo-shamanism I have observed, that are always in intersection between the spiritual, the political, the therapeutic, and some identity-related aspects. Maybe also, I try, yeah. Finally, the reason why I finally choose to call this milieu as neo-shamanic, because it was not really an evidence. And so I really thought about how can I really conceptualize? It is not an easy issue. But in Central America, there are so many terms to designate ritual specialists. There are more than 30 Maya languages. And according to Mercedes de la Garza, an historian of Maya and Nahua culture, she said that there are multiple words in each language for covering different roles related to healing, divination, or mediation with the spiritual world, such as, for example, brujo. Brujo is the sorcerer or the wizard. It's a colonial category for practices that are associated with the use of hallucinogenic plants, or some other words such as curanderos, to say the healers, and many others. So the word shaman does not really appear, but for Mercedes de la Garza, shamanism is foremost an anthropological category. And in the Mesoamerican Nahua and so Nahua for saying Aztec and the Maya field, shamans are people that know how to control their dreams. They are able to heal, including at the distance, or to cause illness. They are able to cross different worlds, what she calls also shamanic journey, or to manage the ritual calendar. And they're also advisors who played important roles in their communities with long initiatory path, ritual use of psychoactive plants, for example, the ololiuki, tobacco, crushed or smoked mushrooms also, and so on. And she says that today, shamanism in Central America refers for her to indigenous ritual practices that actually continue these Mesoamerican traditions. For example, practices involving power plants, ascetic exercises, fasting, or the ritual function of dreams. But there are many adaptations. For example, in the Yucatan, in the southeast of Mexico, those settings often incorporate Catholic elements on their altars, such as crucifixes, angels, images of the Virgin of Guadalupe. So there is a kind of syncretism that is linked to the whole colonial history, but also to globalization. For example, in Chiapas, I observed many rituals that included Catholic popular elements, but also bottles of Coca-Cola, which carries a symbolic meaning in these local communities. So if until the 1990s, some technical terms were used, such as Ishman in Yucatan, Arquinob in Lacandon, Ilol in Tzotziles of Chiapas, Since Carlos Castaneda, Michael Arner, also with the globalization, there are more and more people in Latin America that also began to call themselves shaman and claim a shamanism that is said to be universalist, transcultural, or pan-Indian. So I added this prefix neo to signify that there is a kind of meeting between the local and the global, between the new spiritualities and indigenous cosmovision of Central America. Change the slides. Yeah.
So what emerged clearly from my fieldwork is that the public of neo-shamanic practices is overwhelmingly female, both in France and in Italy. In one of the workshops I observed, for example, 70% of the participants were women between the ages of 35 and 60, while the men were fewer in number and generally younger. This is not a minor detail because it already tells us something about the particular relationship to care that is at stake in these spaces. These women are not simply seeking an exotic spiritual experience. They often arrive at a moment of fragility, transition, or self-redefinition. In fact, the workshop explicitly invites them to engage in work on themselves in response to desires, uncertainties, or form of suffering that are already present. What we see is an accumulation of different care experiences. Participants often move through allopathic therapeutic pathways such as psychotherapy or psychiatry and also turn to meditation, visualization, or yoga techniques. In this sense, they develop a very refined familiarity with a wide range of with a wide range of well-being practices. So we are not dealing with a clear break from other forms of therapy, but rather with a circulation between different ways of caring for oneself and transforming oneself. What becomes visible then is both an accumulation of techniques and a fragmentation or subdivision of therapeutic trajectories. Neo-shamanism does not require lasting loyalty to a single ritual expert. Rather, it is based on a succession of techniques that are expected to produce effects through accumulation rather than through long-term depth. This is why these practices can often be understood as turning points. In my book, I show clearly that they separate ordinary life from something extraordinary, something intensely spiritual. They offer a space in which people can reread their life story, reformulate their suffering, and sometimes recover a sense of coherence. If we want to understand neo-shamanic practices today, we should not see them simply as a return to archaic spirituality. They need to be situated within what we may call a therapeutic society, a social world in which suffering, well-being, self-repair, and the search for meaning have become central. Neo-shamanic seminars are part of this broader ecology of care, at the crossroad of alternative therapies, conventional medicine, and practices of self-work. Following Peter Berger in 1965, we might say that this therapeutic culture is linked to the rise of an Homo psychologicus, shaped by modernity and inclined to interpret life through the language of the psyche and the self-transformation. Within this framework, lived experience becomes a major source of legitimacy. What matters is not only doctrine or lineage, but the fact of having personally felt something, undergone something, experienced something. Emotional intensity and narratives of transformation become signs of authenticity. Practitioners often draw legitimacy from their own biographies, while participants validate the practice through what they feel in their bodies, emotions, and visions. At the same time, people do not come only to relieve symptoms. They come to reconfigure themselves, to restore coherence, and to reinterpret what they are living through. Healing is therefore not just a cure, but a broader process of personal recomposition involving the body, emotion, imagination, and the relationship to the invisible. In this sense, the seminar works as an experiential matrix, not simply a place where ideas are transmitted, but a framework that organizes experience and makes existential reconfiguration possible. Manéli.
Thank you. For the trajectories and the profiles, among the mestizo Latin American and Western, mainly German, Swiss, and Italian participants I've met, they mostly come from upper middle classes with urban backgrounds and have high cultural and educational capital. They have quite enough economic resources to invest time and money in long trainings, in ritual equipment, travels, and to purchase some symbolic objects, educational material, handcrafted drums. And engagement in those paths often follows major life break or significant changes. For example, professional breaks, existential crisis, burnout, people who told me they were tired with conventional modes of social success, episodes also of serious illness, a loss. Many also broke off with conservative Christian families. A lot were saying that they were disappointed from Catholic Church, for example. Also, then a kind of mystical experience usually followed those life issues. They told me that they took place mostly in natural spaces, or sometimes in some Maya archaeological sites, or in a famous mounts or mountain, and they then tried different spiritual practices. And the therapeutic dimension is also quite central. In some cases, trajectories are marked by complex health issues, where shamanism is seen as a resource, where biomedicine has not provided the answer or the solutions they were hoping for. I try to change this. Yeah. And also, gender was also shaping the motivations. Many of the women I've met framed their spiritual engagement as a critique of male dominance within indigenous ritual spaces. They criticized the marginalization of women in contexts such as Yucatan in the southeast of Mexico, where ritual authority is largely held by the Ishman. The Ishman is the local term for the ritual specialist. And so those women call those Ishmen as shamans, and they not self-designate as shamans. So for them, those men are shamans because they are indigenous figures of authority. And those women emphasize the importance of female networks, including midwives, doula, medicine women, or women circles. And many of those women have also experienced sexual or domestic violence. And they are drawing on a kind of spiritual ecofeminism, invoking a divinized archetypal female energy called Mother Earth, or the Grandmother Earth, as a source of mutual healing. And this was really structuring a lot of ritual practices. And those women were also saying they wanted to, I quote, to reconnect with their inner femininity lost since the Spanish colonization. So there is also this kind of critique of the colonial patriarchy, which with a wish to restore pre-colonial shamanic traditions said to be more egalitarian. But motivation are not limited to the search for healing, well-being, or those gender dimensions. In Mexico, they also take place in a context that is marked by a long-standing historical ambivalence in relation to indigenous people. Since the 19th century, the construction of national identity was seeking to homogenize itself through this ideology of mestizaje, mixed heritage. So it has really given rise to state policies that are always in tension between to assimilate indigenous people into national development modes, and also and valorizing them in another sense within foundational myth, but in a folklorized and essentialized manner that really erase, in a sense, the real diversity of indigenous people. And neo-shamanic spiritualities are also within this tension. And among some mestizo leaders of neo-shamanic groups I have met, there is explicitly a political and identity dimension with some discourses on the awakening of a national consciousness in Mexico with the rescue of ancestral cultures, with an anti-colonial language. So the neo-shamanism I observed, there are, of course, some individual biographical rationalities, but there are also some collective dynamics. And I think we cannot really say that neo-shamanism has to be understood only as an individual practice or as a tool for personal development, because in my research, urban middle classes are identifying with an entire indigenous heritage.
Oh, what contemporary neo-shamanic practices show very clearly, first of all, is their transnational dimension. There's a constant circulation of practitioners and participants, but also of ritual repertories themselves. The forms of shamanism presented in France almost always point to an elsewhere, distant either in the space or in time, a so-called Native American, Mongolian, Celtic, Druidic, or ancestral shamanism. In this movement, it is not only people who travel, but also techniques, objects, narratives, and imaginaries. Festivals play a full part in this globalization of the spiritual. The example of the shamanic festival of Dole, where I have took the picture, is particularly revealing. Over 4 days, the public could meet the shamans in attendance directly, watch dances and concerts, receive healing treatments, and also learn therapeutic techniques. What is being offered then is not simply a spectacle, but a sensory, spiritual, and therapeutic experience made available to a broader audience. At the same time, this kind of event shows the close relationship between the search of authenticity and the appropriation of otherness. Participants are looking for something perceived as older, truer, and closer to an original wisdom. Yet this otherness also become accessible, familiar, and almost usable. At the festival, the exotic is no longer distant. It is on stage within rich, made understandable, and reproducible. The question is not so much whether it is true or false, but whether the performance appears coherent and produces symbolic efficacy. What we see then is a deeply hybrid universe in which practices circulate, are transformed, and are rearranged in order to respond to contemporary expectations of healing, meaning, and self-transformation. I carried out multi-sided fieldwork and joined a trip to explore what was presented as so-called Mexican shamanism. The trip to Mexico was organized by an Otomi shaman for about 10 French tourists. The example of the indigenous university in Toluca, Mexico, is particularly revealing for understanding contemporary neo-shamanism. What we see first is the institutionalization of spiritual otherness. Through the online promotion of the ceremony of the 8,000 sacred drums for the healing of Mother Earth, the university is presented as a place of ancestral transmission, founded by an Otomi Toltec spiritual leader and bearer of ancient indigenous knowledge. Everything is designed to make a spiritual elsewhere appear exotic, legitimate, and accessible to a Western audience. The paid journey organized around ceremonies, sacred sites, and accommodation turns this otherness into a structured spiritual offering. Yet the ethnography reveals a clear gap between this promise and the reality. The indigenous university is in fact a very modest building under construction with a single classroom, a few chairs, a few books written by the shaman, that is named Badi in Otomi language, and no real students or teachers. In this sense, it exists less as a university in the usual sense than as a symbolic dispositive of legitimation, giving concrete form to a discourse of tradition. This scene also shows that shamanic knowledge is legitimized performatively. Its credibility does not come from academic validation, but from ceremony, ritual staging, sacred sites, the figure of the body, and the broader dramaturgy of the sacred. The knowledge appears credible because it is performed, embodied, and lived. This transmission remains shaped by a post-colonial asymmetry. French participants traveled to Mexico in search of what they imagined to be real shamanism, but this indigenous knowledge is selected, reformulated, and presented in ways that fit Western expectations. Otherness is thus valued, but also framed, consumed, and reconfigured within a deeply unequal relationship. What we may call a production of legitimacy through the exotization and patrimonialization of Indianness means that in some neo-shamanic settings, credibility does not merely come from a clearly established lineage or from a locally grounded tradition. Rather, it comes from the ability to make otherness immediately visible and emotionally powerful. This legitimacy is built through a series of recognizable signs, costumes, drums, sages, tipis, gestures, and carefully staged ritual settings. Together, these elements give shape to an Indianness imagined as ancient, pure, and full of wisdom. In this process, the indigenous become less a complex social and historical reality than an aestheticized and patrimonialized figure, made available to Western audience searching for meaning. In this sense, we can speak of a form of decontextualized shamanism offered to an international public seeking an imagined indigenous worldview and a source of pure primordial wisdom. As Jacques Galinier writes, the shaman's exegesis is based on a form of hermeneutics that has completely saturated the field of interpretation, unlike traditional shamanism, which refers instead to an implicit form of knowledge. We can also see how this kind of cultural appropriation is embedded in broader logic of commercialization. Tangible and intangible goods, but also experiences and beliefs are turned into commodities. In this context, certain aspects of indigenous cultures are put on the market, reworked, and adapted to the expectations of foreign publics in search of kind of made-to-measure sacred experience, shaped by the same logics of competition and price positioning that govern the international marketplace. Manéli.
Thank you. In relation to transnationality and those issues of authenticity and legitimacy, many things have been already said here but by Denise that are quite similar to my research. But my PhD research that was at the basis of this book began in 2012. It was said to be the year of the end of the world prognosis according to a New Age reading of the Maya calendar. So I had to defend my PhD before the apocalypse, but actually it did not happen. So the discourses were recycled in other perspectives. But at the time, the whole holistic milieu was structuring many practices that were actually presented as a spiritual preparation for a global turning point. And in Central America, some indigenous elites with transnational mobility, they were also producing narratives around 2012, sometimes in dialogue, sometimes in tension with New Age views. So the processes of what I want to say is that the processes of appropriation were never in one direction. Indigenous people also participated in these dynamics, in contact with mystical tourism, giving new readings of their own practices. But what most interested me here in this issue was the impact of this mobility on the creation of new religious identities that were always developing between the local and global dynamics. I observed, for example, forms of religious exoticism. That were already said also by Denise, where indigenous worldviews were idealized, domesticated, and invested with this idea of authenticity. And in those processes, violent, sacrificial, conflictual aspects of Mesoamerican iconography were totally neutralized. For example, the figure of Mother Earth the telluric principle that can be either male or female in Mesoamerican cosmovisions was no longer understood as a potentially destructive or chthonic creative force closely tied to agriculture that constantly demands blood or sperm, as the ethnologist Jacques Galinier, quoted also by Denise, has shown, for example. But it was read as a nurturing and benevolent mother, a source of healing aligned with an ideal of harmony. So I try to... So this mobility was leading to some reconfigurations and that were linked to issues of legitimacy and authenticity. The urban neo-shamanism I observed differed from community-based shamanism in urban peripheries or rural areas. And those differences were also underlined in the discourses of the practitioners I've met. I will give the example of a Yucatec Ishman that you see here on the slide. He told me that he doesn't really understand some of the new shamanic practices in Yucatan. For him, a true spiritual guide learned through oral transmission, uses Maya language in rituals, give ceremonies that are free of charge or based on donation, and lineage was also very important in his discourse. And he also spoke of being chosen after a path of existential trials, guided by signs he received in dreams, which led him to gradually learn how to manage forces. By contrast, neo-shamanism often involved self-proclaimed or certified practitioners. Rituals conducted, they were in Spanish or in English. The focus was on individual healing, but sometimes also, as I said, involved broader collective or national identity narratives. And they were commercialized and the trainings were very short. So what it is interesting is that the Ishman Yashkin that I've met, he was sometimes also negatively perceived by other local Ishman in Yucatan for his travels to Germany and the United States, where he was invited for giving ceremonies, and his mobility was also impacting his own relationship with his practice with the integration of new references. So it is just to say that the boundaries between the so-called traditional shamanism and a global neo-shamanism, which are often assumed in classical ethnology, I think still remain kind of fragile and quite absorbent. But of course, there is a political difference that is related to the whole post-colonial issues and debates, and this issue that Denise also presented around the cultural appropriation. So this was a little bit about the transnational aspects. And finally, our last point, the last axis of our lecture is in relation with those issues of spiritual tourism. The 2012 phenomena transformed the Maya calendar into a kind of global spiritual commodity, and it started to structure neo-shamanic practices such as limpias, that are purifications in the public urban spaces, initiations, retreats, and festivals, also, as said Denise. And it also impacted the tourism industry a lot across Mexico, and in general in Central America. For example, on December 21st of 2012, 20,000 people were expected at the archaeological site, Maya site of Chichen Itza in the Yucatan. And in Tulum, the ritual Maya calendar was also displayed in the main square of the town. I think that was the last slide, yeah. But neo-shamanism trends were already developing before in the 1980s and 1990s in Central America, especially around the Maya area with a form of ecotourism. And nowadays there are also more and more cacao ceremonies, which is something quite new actually. And this for the practitioners I've met goes with some representations around space. People I've met generally consider Western society as empty of spirituality, and some places of Latin America, such as Tulum, for example, in Mexico, as lands of healing and self-connection. And part of these neo-shamanic settings, there are also pilgrimages that are organized to ancient Mayan city, and those pilgrimages stage many different issues. I followed a neo-shamanic group to Uxmal, in Yucatan for the 10-day ceremonies dedicated to a local divinity. So Uxmal was one of the most important political, religious, and ceremonial center of the classic Maya civilization, and it is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And the leader of this neo-shamanic group claimed that she had received some visions at this site, which was forming a kind of spiritual narrative behind the pilgrimage. And so on that day, there were a lot of mother shamans, so this is the self-designation, from across Mexico that were participating. And the topic was, I quote, the unification of the sacred female and sacred male. And so at the entrance, officials from the National Institute of Anthropology and History who managed those sites in Mexico seemed to be very aware of the activities of the group. And so they gave us kind of easy access. So then we did a long procession. We moved toward the main temple of Uxmal, walking in a kind of hierarchy, and then during the walk, some tourists at Uxmal were watching us, some smiling and other also recording us. So there was this kind of mise en abîme. I was myself filmed while I was recording the procession. And then after prayers at the pyramid, the group moved to a small place for a ritual to 4 directions and 4 elements. So there was this kind of strong performativity associated with an image or a spirit of pre-colonial rituals, including power structures, spatial dimensions, gender dimensions, etc. And then the following days, we first went to Labna, which is another Maya city from classic period. And Labna is known for a temple with an arch. And in Mesoamerican shamanism, the symbol of the arch is linked to the notion of passage between the worlds. It could also mark the ritual or the political space. But this specific neo-shamanic group had another reading. And they were saying that it was a kind of door to access to another level of consciousness. And then we visited the mask of Shak. Shak is a deity traditionally in Yucatan. It is associated with agriculture, with rain, with lightning, thunder, with water, with the 4 directions. And it is usually represented with a face that is part human, part serpent, as you can also see on the left on the slide. And again, the group was seeing it as a symbol of a solar pranic breathing with open mouth appearing to receive solar rays. So there was this whole alternative reading of those sites that was produced that was claimed to be intuitive or vision-based. And so finally, we went to the final archaeological site in Yaxquilan, and the group was denied access. So they refused us the access because of the array of accessories, instruments, ritual objects. And so the officials of the National Institute of Anthropology and History that were at the entrance said, no, it could damage the temples. So there are now, with the spread of those neo-shamanic rituals in those sites, there are new cultural policies. And those rituals have been also progressively prohibited in the name of the monument preservations. And it also started to affect local indigenous people, particularly the Ishman, the healers of the Yucatan, who were also always telling me that it's because of those I quote, fake shamans, that these restrictions were imposed and that their own rituals are actually more discreet. So there was this kind of tensions, also issues between spiritual claims, between indigenous communities, neo-shamanic performativity in those sites. So it was maybe just to say that spatial aspect are also very important in those neo-shamanic settings. I think, Denise, you can go for the last.
So, as I said, I follow a group of French tourists in Mexico. And for example, at the site of the site like Malinalco, that you can see in the picture, you can observe what is almost a somatic use of sacred spaces. These pre-Hispanic ruins establish a relationship to the site through a physical trial of the body. One has to climb 380 steps, endure the heat, the crowd, the noise, and the altitude, even before the ritual began. The archaeological site is therefore not simply seen, it is experienced through the body. This embodied dimension is reinforced by the discourse of a local guide who speaks about ritual mutilation, fasting, confinement, and the endurance of ancient warriors. The pre-Hispanic past is presented as a memory of pain, asceticism, and the overcoming of bodily limits. This narrative is then taken up by the Otomi shaman leading the French group, but he transformed its meaning. Ancient initiatory violence becomes an ordeal of inner transformation, a struggle of the self upon itself. In this way, we move from the image of a sacrificed body to that of a body worked upon as a site of personal realization. The archaeological ruins thus become a form of collective somatic orchestration. At the top of the pyramid, local and foreign tourists witness with the sage fumigations, songs in vernacular languages, and the sounds of the drum filling the space. Through his clothing, his performed Indianness, and his dramatized gestures, the Otomi shaman embodies the ritual body as a medium between space, invisible forces, and the assembled group. Next to him, a woman that we can see on the picture, lying on the rock, receives a treatment through the circulations of hands without direct contact, but with visible effects, muscular contraction, sudden movement, tension in the chest. Further away, sound healing centers on a person surrounded by caracol players blowing upward to chase away spirits. The body becomes a surface of diagnosis crossed by flows, blockages, and invisible forces. Here, the archaeological site no longer separates the history of the place, the ancestor, the present bodies, emotions, and spiritual agencies. Everything becomes part of one somatic continuum. The last one is about another experience that I had during my fieldwork in Mexico with some other colleague from the University of the UNAM. And I do not want to oppose true and false shamanism, because for me that distinction is not very useful as an anthropologist. Instead, I want to show that different ritual systems operate according to very different logics. I had the opportunity to take part in an Otomi pilgrimage to Mexico Chiquito or Mayonica, an old ritual practice deeply rooted in la costumbre, that is, in custom and in a system of obligation. Otomi people from the Mexican Sierra Madre, down the south of the Huasteca, are expected to undertake this pilgrimage at least once in their lives. So this is not an individual search for personal growth, but a ritual, social, and cosmological commitment. The pilgrimage itself is a process, what we may call a kinetic ritual. Transformation takes place through movement, duration, and the bodily experience of a collective path. On the day of the ceremony, the shaman, or body, to me, performs a series of rituals in which he uses scissors to give life to small anthropomorphic figurines called nthaki. These figurines are sprinkled with drops of chicken blood and placed on altars set among pre-Hispanic ruins. Around them are candles of different colors, each with a specific meaning, as well as cloth offering left by previous pilgrims. So people do not simply come to pray or to be good. They participate in making invisible forces present through objects, blood, colors, altars, and codified gestures. What we see is a very concrete relationship between humans, spiritual entities, ruins, and sacred territory. This has very little to do with the Neo-Otomi shaman I encountered in France. Here, ritual is not about exploring the inner self, but about maintaining an obligatory relationship with an inhabited world, with places, powers, and ritual heritage that goes far beyond the individual. Okay, I have finished. We are in time.
Well, thank you very, very much, Manéli and Denise. We're going to open it up for questions. And to start, I will pose a little bit of my own wonderings. Definitely, my mind was going in lots of different directions, listening to both of your presentations. And I have numerous questions, but to start, I'm curious to hear a little bit more from both of you about what you've noticed about issues of agency and of the separation of the self or the non-separation of the self with others, both people in the physical world, with the spirits, all of these type of things, because as we know from various contexts, sometimes with shamanism or shamanic type practices, there is more or less issues of self-agency. And also sometimes it's viewed as a positive thing and something that raises a person's status, engaging in shamanism and becoming a shaman, whereas other times it can have very much the opposite effect that it's viewed as a negative but an obligation where there isn't so much self-agency. I'm not sure if I'm making sense with that.
Yeah.
If you want, as you want. You want to start?
But I just have one thought about this. Thank you, Margaret. It's a very interesting question. I don't know about this notion of self-agency. It looks to me a kind of Western notion, but it didn't really appear like this actually in the Maya renewal shamanic settings I have observed. There is, of course, they were always saying, for example, the Ishmen, they were always saying that there are some links between the visible world and the invisible world, but it was not issued like that. There was not the invisible word was not called the invisible word in the sense that it was not invisible for them. So the grid of reading was not actually with those concepts. But of course, there is always this aspect of continuity between ancestors, spirits, deities, between, as said Denise, objects, settings, candles, etc. And they're not just symbolic relations, but that they're really active relationship, and they are active in the sense that they also shape how they see illness or disease or human body. And so the borders, there are no such borders in terms that everything is it is a very complex network of relationships, active relationships. And so it was also considered that the gods could eat people or they are punitive, they are devouring, so we have to do offerings always, and the blood, for example, sacrifices, self-scarification also is seen as a way to do this, to give this balance always, and to balance the relationships and to create this continuity. So I don't know if actually in the settings of community shamanism, I have observed there's no such notion of borders. It is more, everything is really connected and always changing, and according also to the forces of the day, and so they also always consult the calendar, for example, for the kin of the day. So the day is saying what are the dispositions, what are the forces. So you are acting according to this. Yeah.
Thank you. Me too. I agree with what Manéli proposed, because even in the community that I have followed in the group, it's not so clear. Everything is really, really blurred, and people do not ask if it's true, if it's false, where entities are expected to be, and how to act with them. It is more about the feeling, about the intention, about the emotion of being there. And another thing that I just in which I didn't go too much on, it was about how you can become a shaman in Western societies. It's not matter of long tradition or heritage. You can start following a shaman, and so you go on building your own personal way of being shaman. Always had the different practices, and the trip, the travel to the country like Mexico, especially, or Mongolia, it's very a classical step on the way of people patrimonialize in a certain way their own experience. So there's not a heritage. There is no heritage. I remember that, for example, for the Siberian shamanism, being a shaman for the female Siberian shamanism, it was Jean-Luc Lambert at the EPHE who explained this very well. It was really a sort of danger. They were obliged to become shaman because of their heritage. And it was a sort of symbolic rape from the spirits. So nobody wants to be shaman. On the contrary, in our society, everybody wants to be a shaman, I don't know, to embody this kind of otherness through this sort of exoticism of alterity. I don't know if I have answered to your question, but yeah, the idea of agency is not the first one that I can that I have in mind when I reflect on neo-shamanic practices.
Maybe just
Thank you.
I just had one last word on that issue was that on the contrary, on the women's circle that were practicing Maya-inspired shamanism, this notion of agency was very important. Like it was really an issue of self-empowerment. Like the borders were much more clear in the sense that it was to gain symbolical inner power in relation to connect with nature, to Mother Earth, to the sky, to the plants, etc. So here the self-agency was more really embedded in this idea of a personal inner bodily border. Yeah.
Thank you. I definitely have more questions, and I think that that's an incredibly interesting topic. So thank you both very much for your thoughts on the matter. Before I go in any further to my own questions, I would like to invite anyone who might have questions either to raise your hand or pose them in the chat, whichever is most conducive. But perhaps while waiting to see about other questions, and we have a comment, a question from, one moment, please. I'm having difficulty seeing the
You can?
question.
I think
From Albin Rodrigo, who asks, have you met people involved with these contemporary rituals who are still mentioning the influence of Carlos Castañeda's books on the subject?
Yes, I didn't present a part of the trip that I did with the Mexican shaman, that it was close to Toluca at the ceremonial center of Otomi ceremonies. It was for the 21 of March, the solstice, okay, or the equinox. I always I'm always wrong. And it was really interesting because on the same space was occupied in one side from the Otomi shaman, the indigenous one, and the other side there were the Castanedian who made a fumigation around people and who proposed to travel to the north to find to go to reach peyote, the cactus. And it was interesting, it was a sort of fight, a sort of battle between the shaman, because the Castanedian shaman, who apparently was a blonde hair with blue eyes, criticized the Indian shamans, the Otomi, saying that those was the false shaman, because the only true original shamanism in Mexico could be only the Castanedian one. So yes, but another things very important is that for Western people, if you go to see on the library of Western participants, you found always Castaneda's books, but even Mircea Elias's books, and Castaneda's books were, till since 10 years ago, one of the most translated books on the world. Now, I don't think that is still the same, but it is really, 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 really known from the people. I don't know if they read this as a novel or they take it as a real, a sort of Bible, but it circulates. A lot of a big part of the shamanic practices is based on lectures. People read a lot of books about shamanism. They go for sure on internet, on Facebook groups, Instagram, and all this kind of media. More Facebook, because they are quite old, so they are not so young people that follow those shamanic paths. So it's very various, as heterogeneous, but the books are always a very important part of this kind of knowledge, of Western knowledge. It is still important in the experience of shamanism.
Mm. And for my research, Carlos Castaneda was a kind of reference in Mexico, also because the story he's telling is happening in Mexico. And so it was a reference, especially among some Yucatec neo-shamanic groups, that some members were saying, okay, I've been to a conference that is with someone that was close to Carlos Castaneda. So there is a kind of genealogy that goes to Carlos Castaneda. And also what I've written in my book, it was one of the influence of Carlos Castaneda was also on the way people were telling their life stories. It was always, the biographies were always recounted as initiatory narratives in a style quite similar that is found in the novels of Carlos Castaneda. It was always the kind of same characteristic, like the centrality of a spiritual master in a mystical journey, but also signs to discover, to guess, to understand, inexplicable some coincidences. Also the fact to say that it is not our own will that is at play, but rather a kind of bigger will. So the narratives were also always saying that there were some transformations in the spiritual journey through the people they've met, through the signs, those kind of things. So I think that was one influence of Carlos Castaneda style in the way people tell about their trajectories.
Thank you. We are at 17 after, but I would like to ask if anyone else has any questions they would like to pose.
Yes?
Yes, Simon?
Yes, thank you for the talk. I think it will be inspirational for a lot of people who are working on similar topics. I'm doing ethnographic work on psychedelic movements in Italy and Spain. And yes, I have just a question, just really general question. about if we have a better definition or if we have any definition of the word. I don't know if it's really a concept of spirituality. Because sometimes no, there is a big difference between now it's anemic word, no? But how can we define spirituality?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Something that for me that I realized on my fieldwork is that spirituality was not used the same way according to if the person was in Switzerland, in Mexico, in Guatemala, in Germany. So it was always situated. So, for example, in Guatemala, the Achkijab I've met, they were using the notion of spirituality, which is etymologically a Christian notion, but as an anti-Christian way, in an anti-Christian way. So it was a kind of post-colonial use of the notion and a political use of the notion of spirituality. And they were saying, we are doing spirituality, but evangelicals, the evangelical are doing religion. And so it was a way of saying our spirituality is more fluid, is more, and so they also recalled the cosmologies of Maya spirituality, that is for them the heart of Maya cosmology that they were rescuing in a sense, or rereading, of course, but rescuing in a sense. So it was kind of very specific to the cultural. So for me, finally, I said in my research, so spirituality for me, I'm really using the work of Boas Huss. Boas Huss, he's an historian of religion that is working on Kabbalah and among other. And he wrote this beautiful article on this notion of spirituality. He's doing this whole genealogical work. And he is saying, actually, it's a cultural rhetoric that is behind this notion of spirituality. It's a cultural production. So it is not something that is really immutable, that is really unchangeable, that you can find in every context at the same time or different times, that are expressing the same empirical religious or I don't know, empirical phenomena. But the really it's for me it was I was more interested on the meta discourses around the notion of spirituality, is to say how people signify this notion of spirituality and what it is and to what context it is a response. Yeah.
So nice to meet you, Simone. I agree totally with what Manéli said, because in fact we can start from the difference between religion and spirituality, and about the fact that in shamanism there's no a church, a shamanic church. There's not a clergy. It's really, really, really clear in the neo-shamanism that I have studied. So. But if we take the point of view of practitioner, it's totally different. They don't take care about what is this. For them, it's only to feel something, to be in contact with a blurry essence, some entities that they cannot really afford. Because, for example, I did not talk a lot about the totemic animal. It's really interesting as a figure, because it is sensed to be inside the person and outside the person. So are all those kind of entities that are not fixed, that they can change, but they have to have an haptic form, because people can have they have to have a relationship with them. They have to touch, to look, to talk. Always in this strange dimension that is inside, outside. It is an imagination, not at all. It is a vision, maybe yes, maybe not. So all this, I think that the spirituality in this specific kind of practices, it is a sort of liminality of being something other. In a certain way. To practice is to be spiritual. But even with French people, they don't talk explicitly about spirituality. It is more a sort of technical term that we, as a researcher, we have to use it to, because there's a big problem on what kind of term we can use to talk about this, to escape categories. We need maybe a new vocabulary to talk about neo-shamanism. I don't know, maybe we are doing this during this kind of conferences. But I think that they are sort of hold the term spirituality, the definition against religious. So it doesn't fit really. It is changing. Things go very fast. So I don't think that the spiritual that we can talk about spiritual things, about esotericism, for example, there's not a lot to do about the spiritual feeling of people, of contemporary Western people that went to Mexico, for example, to attend those kind of trip, or even during the seminar that I have studied in France. So we needed to found another language.
Okay.
Okay. Oh,
Thank you, Manéli and Denise. I think that this conversation could go on for a while and be very interesting, but we do need to be mindful of our time constraints. So if there aren't any more absolute pressing questions, I appreciate the applause and definitely thank you both for sharing a little bit about your work today. I think that it will definitely carry on in our reflections and development of our ideas about a variety of things. And again, oh, we do have, let's see what, thank you, Nicola. For next session, we will have Yael Dansak and Emily Pierney speaking to us about the Marie Curie Fellowship Program in May, on May 5th, which is a wonderful opportunity to learn more about this program from two people who have succeeded in going through the program. And that will be our last lecture until next October. And again, for anyone who is not on our mailing list, I would very much encourage you to sign up to be on it. There are a lot of very, very interesting, a lot, important. I wouldn't say a lot. We're not getting spammed all the time, but definitely very interesting, important announcements about conferences going on from our colleagues, opportunities to network with different people and get involved with different projects working on all this. So definitely sign up. And thank you very much for joining us today to everyone. And thank you again very much to Manéli and Denise for all of their work in sharing their research with us today. And with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their evening or day, depending on where you are.
Thanks.
thank you.
Bye-bye.